My name is Sanjay Ahuja. I'm a pediatric hematologist and I am the Chief Medical and Informatics Officer at Innovative Hematology, Indiana Hemophilia and Thrombosis Center in Indianapolis. I treat bleeding and clotting disorders in children and adults, and hemophilia is one of them. So, hemophilia is a genetically transmitted bleeding disorder. So it's a congenital bleeding disorder that somebody is born with, and you can have factor VIII or factor IX deficiency. Because of the levels of severity of deficiency a person has, you can have a variety of bleeding symptoms, all the way from spontaneous bleeding events, especially into the joints, to bleeding events that are due to results of any injury or surgery, trauma in those situations. It is treated by replacing the missing protein. It was for many years treated by replacing the missing protein, which is either factor VIII or factor IX, depending on what deficiency you have. The factor products had different half-lives. They're always administered intravenously. So those two things created the biggest barriers for therapy in patients with hemophilia. So the treatment burden itself, because it was intravenous, meant that boys who usually get hemophilia, is a disorder that is mainly seen in males and not as much in females. So men were taught to administer factor intravenously as early as 10 to 12 years of age, because that's what they had to live with for their entire life. And depending on the half-life, the factor was administered either twice a week, thrice a week, to sometimes once a week. And now we have a newer advancement where you can actually administer the factor once a week in factor VIII and about once every 2 weeks in factor IX therapies. But those also are the biggest barriers for good, successful outcomes, because if you don't treat prophylactically, depending on your severity, then it causes severe joint damage because there's a lot of bleeding into the joints that happens. And over time, that causes disability in patients with hemophilia. So in the field of hemophilia, we are very fortunate that a number of advancements that have happened in the last 5 years has really expanded the treatment options that are available for patients. One such treatment option is the approval of a drug named Qfitlia, which had a name of Fitusiran when it was studied in the clinical trials. This is one of a kind in the sense that it's a new, innovative mechanism of action that has not been administered before this in hemophilia. It's not a factor product in the traditional sense, in the sense that it does not replace the missing protein. However, it works by decreasing another protein called antithrombin. And by doing so, it improves thrombin generation, which is the real underlying issue in patients with hemophilia. And the way it does it is a small interfering double-stranded RNA. So it's siRNA. And this technology was initially sort of developed by Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. And by way of this siRNA therapy, it is able to silence the gene for antithrombin within the liver. And by doing so, it decreases the amount of antithrombin protein that one circulates in the body. One of the functions of antithrombin, as the name suggests, is to inhibit thrombin, which is a important molecule or driver of clotting. So by inhibiting antithrombin, it improves thrombin generation and hence decreases and sometimes eliminates bleeding events in patients with hemophilia whose main deficiency is thrombin generation. This is one of those few drugs in hemophilia that has a standard dose that is going to be administered to all patients. First of all, this is approved for patients 12 and above with hemophilia A or B, so either with factor VIII or IX deficiency, with or without inhibitors. And it is a fixed dose to start with, but the variability lies in how it is monitored is with antithrombin levels. So the protein that it obviously silences the gene but decreases the protein of antithrombin, the drug maintains the antithrombin level or is recommended between 15 and 35% antithrombin activity. So everybody starts Qfitlia at the same dose of 50 milligrams subcutaneously. So that's the one big advantage of this drug, that is subcutaneous, and it is every 2 months. So the interval is tremendously beneficial to patients who are currently dealing with once a week in factor VIII and once every 2 weeks in factor IX intravenous therapy sometimes. By maintaining the levels between 15 and 35%, you can assure thrombin generation at a level that is protective for bleeding events, but also assure that the negative side effect profile of something like decreasing antithrombin could be avoided, such as thromboembolic events. So initially, it's recommended that you measure antithrombin activity before you start the drug to see where you are starting from as a baseline. And then after that, it is recommended to be measured at month 1, 3, 5, and 6. However, once you achieve the target range, then it is very stable. And it has been studied over a number of years that it is very stable and you don't need to adjust the dose because the levels don't change much. For example, in the pivotal trial that led to the approval, 35% of the patients required no dose adjustment at all, and 55% required one dose adjustment. So if you put all that together, majority of the patients had either 0 or 1 dose adjustment. The FDA approval for Qfitlia was based on data from the Atlas clinical trial program. So it was a development program for this drug. And across all subgroups, Qfitlia demonstrated low bleeding rates with the number of injections I mentioned, which is 6 injections a year, so every 2 months. And the reduction in bleed reduction, that was the primary endpoint, was 71% reduction in annualized bleeding rate, or ABR, versus clotting factor that was given on demand in patients without inhibitors. And here the p-value was less than 0.0001. In patients with inhibitors, there was a 73% reduction in annualized bleeding rate when compared to bypassing agents, which is a therapy that is used for patients with inhibitors. And that was done on demand. So in here also the p-value was equal to 0.0006. So it is in line with what factor concentrates reduce the bleeding rates. However, the advantage here is that this is subcu and it's less number of injections per year to achieve the similar results. So currently, Qfitlia is only approved for patients with hemophilia A or B, with or without inhibitors above the age of 12. There are no studies that I'm aware of that are looking to use Qfitlia in other rare bleeding disorders. However, if you look at the mechanism of action, which is improving thrombin generation, it makes sense that it would be useful and beneficial in that population. So we look forward to the further development of this molecule in other rare bleeding disorders where therapies are not as good as in hemophilia, and hopefully it will be useful in that population too.